Good evening and a very warm welcome to the first seminar of 2022 held by the Research Centre for German and Austrian Exile Studies attached to the Institute of Modern Languages Research at the University of London. This seminar examines the impact of exile on the life and work of the artist Joe Bondy, 1937 to 2015. It is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Jennifer Taylor. She is a founder member of the Research Centre for German and Austrian Exile Studies. She has published widely on several aspects of exile, including the internment correspondence of Paul and Charlotte Bondy, and their contribution to the re-education program for German-speaking prisoners of war after the Second World War. Her talk concentrates on the life and work of Paul and Charlotte's only child, Joanna, Jo, and attempts to assess the impact of exile on her work as a representative of the second generation. The provocative product of Jo's pop art period, evidence of the vicissitudes of exile, is contrasted to her more orthodox work, testimony to the conformist side of her character, which led to her to ensure the preservation of her parents' legacy. It is now my pleasure to ask Jennifer to speak, to ask you to speak now.
Thank you, Joanna, for that introduction. I'm speaking today on the impact of exile on the life and work of the artist Joe Bondy. Joe Bondy was born in Chelsea, an appropriate location for an artist, in June 1937, the first and only child of Paul and Charlotte Bondy. Charlotte, who was not of Jewish heritage, had been born in Munich in 1907 to a professional family and subsequently worked in a commercial environment as an in-house package designer. It was there she met her future husband, Paul, born in Bremen in 1900 of Jewish heritage, who had previously worked abroad in several administrative capacities. Both had been briefly imprisoned in 1935 and eventually both escaped to London, where they married in 1936. During the Blitz, the family moved to Mill Hill to escape the bombing. This was but one incidence of dislocation experienced by this émigré father. Joe's father was interned in Huyton for 6 months in the second half of 1940, and parental absence was again experienced in the immediate post-war years when Paul spent 6 months working on a denazification program in Munich under the aegis of the OSS. Thereafter, he was to have a varied career involved in various business ventures, none of which were particularly successful. Additionally, in the early post-war years, the family was housed in cramped rented accommodation, which required Paul's mother, whom he had succeeded in rescuing from Germany in 1938, to sleep on a sofa. At the age of 10, Jo was taken on an adventurous journey across Germany to visit her maternal grandmother in Munich and had the opportunity to observe the post-war devastation of a defeated nation. None of this made for a particularly restful childhood, and the effects were soon evident in a turbulent adolescence when Jo, whose behaviour had been affected by the anti-German sentiments prevalent at the time, was asked to leave her school. Eventually, the situation was resolved, and Jo finished her education at St George's School in Harpenden in Hertfordshire. Thereafter, she trained at St Albans College of Art and then did a year's teacher training at the Institute of Education in London. Later, when her work had received some measure of recognition, she is quoted as saying that at that time she had no ambition for herself or her creative ability, and had gone to art school simply because it seemed the only thing she could do at the time. Her ambition, she said in that interview, was to develop much later. Nevertheless, this decision to train as an artist is testament to her mother's influence, who, when teaching Jo the manners appropriate for a middle-class child, spoke of drawing a thank you letter rather than writing one, resulting in illustrated letters which delighted her friends. Her mother encouraged her artistic production, preserving many examples of Jo's juvenilia in her diaries. Initially, Jo returned to St. George's School to work in the art department, thereafter working in the same capacity in secondary schools and ending her career in the state sector at Ravenscroft School in Barnet in North London, where among her duties was that of being form tutor to John Bercow, who was later to serve as Speaker of the House of Commons, although it is unclear the extent to which her pastoral care influenced the formation of his character. Initially, Jo worked in paintings in 2 dimensions. The appeal of the box form, which she was later to develop, is indicated in this piece. Attached to the canvas is a small box which opened to reveal a sunflower. It was then a logical progression to work wholly in 3 dimensions and to produce such boxes. In moving from 2 to 3 dimensions, Jo was following the example of her mother, who in the early post-war years had attempted to establish herself as a designer of commercially produced soft toys. As is evident from this image of a duck from the Peeky toy range, this venture had, in her mother's case, been unsuccessful. The range of toys which resulted from commercial production in 1947 did not reflect an artistic vision which demanded the fluidity of movement to confer an individual signature which would then be instantly recognizable as Charlotte's creation. This vision proved to be incompatible with mass production. Jo faced no such difficulties, since she was not concerned with mass production. Each of her boxes was a handcrafted objet d'art. In this respect, her business plan was more successful than her mother's, but she was also lucky in finding, at a comparatively early age in her career, in Nicholas Treadwell, a like-minded colleague who could display and market her art on a regular basis. In choosing boxes as her art form, Jo was following in the footsteps of the American artist Joseph Cornell, the most celebrated exponent of assemblage, who had been influenced by the Surrealists, an artist who had been influential when she was at college. Cornell was also an exponent of collage, an avant-garde technique also used extensively by Kurt Schwitters, who died in 1948 and who had spent the final years of his life in the Lake District. But it is unlikely that this émigré artist would have featured in the curriculum of Jo's art college. Jo began making her boxes in 1967 and claimed she was concerned to avoid any overindulgence into the too decorative or too tasteful. The following boxes from the early 70s, which I have named Heart Box, and we have the interior, the close-up here, and Silver Box. The following boxes do not seem to adhere fully to this doctrine. And the Silver Box close-up. Thank you. They are certainly decorative and arguably tasteful. However, odds and ends is disconcerting, containing as it does a half-buried doll and a disembodied hand featuring, if somewhat tentatively, body parts, a feature explored with greater emphasis in other works Jo created in this decade. Furthermore, the juxtaposition of cards depicting the poppy and a devotional image of the Sacred Heart could be read as an intellectual joke, evoking the Marxian dictum that religion was the opium of the people. Similarly critical of organized religion is Box of Soldiers' Comforts, an ironic subversion of the votive offering boxes to be found in many churches, which implies that the function of the soldiers whose health is restored or maintained by these offerings is to bomb and maim women and children. The hand extended to administer this aid is maimed, while the bombs, with smiles on their faces, appear misleadingly innocuous, like children asleep in a bed. Similarly critical of the establishment is Jo's contribution to Treadwell's celebration of the Queen's reign in the exhibition Happy and Glorious, held in 1975. Variously titled Souvenir Box for a Sovereign and a Box of Memorabilia. The interior of this piece, which is designed more like a cabinet than a box, is dominated by the Queen's torso, decorated with a garter ribbon and other insignia, which dwarfs the figures of the bride and groom. While outside the frame of the box, a disembodied head, complete with diadem, looms over everything. Memorabilia, including a pair of fashionable sunglasses, are stuffed into the corners of the box and the drawer below. The disconcerting effect of this distortion of perspective subverts the grander historical narrative displayed on the doors. A door on the left opens to reveal the cover of a booklet containing the royal family tree. This is balanced by a similar door on the right-hand side, which opens to reveal photos of the current royal family superimposed on a larger portrait of the first Queen Elizabeth. The location of the memorabilia, stuffed into the corners of the box and the drawer below, completes this exercise in devaluation of the legacy. Despite these elements of disjunction which subvert the iconography, these works contain fewer provocative elements of shock or surprise than her contributions to the two Treadwell exhibitions, Nude or Naked in 1974-5 and Sporting Pictures 1976, works which can indubitably be classed as her pop art period. Jo's response to Nude or Naked was anatomically explicit, complete, as she took pains to point out in a contemporary press review, complete with pubic hair made out of horsehair. When interviewed at the time, she described it as a laugh, not nasty, a dirty joke. But it was, of course, much more than that, for it can be argued that in her recourse to fragmentation, to reducing the human form to mere body parts, she is reflecting the dislocation and uncertainty of exile. Similarly sexually explicit is an earlier work from 1970 in which, I quote, "The mannequin's sheer pink knickers are stuffed with shredded pictures of men escaping the seams like pubic hair." The commentator here, the art historian Philomena Epps, like Jo herself, in her comment on Nude or Naked, described this as bawdy humour. Yet Epps considers that the fragmentation, the model is without a head, the fragmentation exemplifies the objectification of women's bodies. Here too, then, there is recognition that Jo's work points towards something more significant than mere smut. Epps argues this in terms of the emerging feminist movement, to which I would add that this work could also be analysed from the point of view of the psychological damage inflicted by exile. It could be said that Jo's work embodies the trauma which she inherited. Jo's critical gaze could also be directed at political themes. Hunter's Box, her contribution to Treadwell's exhibition Sporting Pictures 1976, Hunter's Box combines a critique of fox hunting. Hunter's Box combines a critique of fox hunting from the perspective of class warfare and the feminist struggle, since, as Epps remarks, this upper class sport was equated with socially sanctioned violence against women. In this work, instead of a box, there is a case, a 7-foot-high wooden structure shaped like a grandfather clock, which, I quote from a contemporary press review, which conceals a protest against the barbaric custom of blooding. The door in the case opens to reveal, I quote, a naked, blood-stained female body in the recess, strung up like a hunted fox. Unfortunately, this slide is not too clear, but the body, I can assure you, is there where the arrow is pointing. The tone of this work, which, in its desire to dissect women's bodies and to court shock as a primary emotional response, the tone of this work can be described as pop art from a feminist perspective. This is radically different from the more traditional approach of her mother. Charlotte's vision was more contained. This is an example of one of the animals that Charlotte made. Charlotte's vision was more contained, less provocative, even though the fluid lines of her three-dimensional animal figures displayed innovative features which invite the description of soft sculpture. This, I just have to clarify, this doll was a one-off. It wasn't commercially produced. And I think if you contrast it with the picture of the duck that we saw earlier, you can see that it's much more lively and it has better kinetic qualities. Dislocation and fragmentation are not the only techniques employed by Jo which could be said to reflect the experience of exile. The choice of the materials themselves, such as mirrored glass and netting, we can see some of that in this slide of Torso Box, which I've shown you before. The choice of the materials themselves, as well as the use of cut-out panels for her mixed media constructions, serve to distort reality as well as reflect it, a further indication of the influence of the uncertainties of exile. In this slide of Torso Box, you can see a cut-out panel just below the model's bosom with a seascape on it. Jo's boxes were designed to disconcert. Commentators, including Jo herself, who is quoted as saying, "A box and its contents have power, mystery and intrigue." Commentators remark on the emotional impact of opening the boxes, an experience, it is implied, which is tantamount to a voyeuristic exercise. I quote from a contemporary press review. "The best of her boxes play on our human weaknesses to an almost cruel degree. We experience curiosity, shock, surprise, humour, embarrassment, intrigue, and finally, a compelling fascination, and we can't wait to open up the next one." This exploitation of human weakness could be an indication of the psychological trauma of the second generation. Yet it's possible to go even further than this and argue that the encapsulation of such disturbing examples of human experience signals a psychological disposition to compartmentalize, to hide aspects of the self, a technique that those who have experienced lives disrupted by exile learn to employ. From this perspective, closing the box is an action whose significance is equal, if not superior, to opening the box. For example, when she was exposed to anti-German sentiment in her formative years, and the disjunction between her monolingualism and the bilingualism of her parents, Jo must have learnt early to compartmentalize, a habit retained throughout her life, and one on which many of her loyal friends were to remark after her death. Not all of Jo's work was as radical as the material produced during her pop art phase. The pop art period of production has been chosen here since it illustrates most graphically the tropes of exile: fragmentation, dislocation, disjunction, and distortion. Her archive attests to studies and finished works using more traditional materials and portraying more traditional subjects. Her sketchbooks show works in several media, pen, pencil, and watercolor, and contain studies of a wide range of subjects: the human form, animals, streetscapes, landscapes, and seascapes, all in conventional form. She regularly spent her summers in the south of France, near Arles, where she had been able to acquire a cottage, although she was not able to afford property in London until she was in her 50s. In the spring of 1970, for example, she exhibited her work at Salier, near Arles, and received an enthusiastic accolade for her landscape studies inspired by the wild mountainous terrain of the Cevennes. This pencil sketch, one of many in her archive, this pencil sketch dated August 1991 shows that she was an accomplished draftswoman. And this flowers study shows her mastery of the conventional watercolor form. Her sketchbooks are annotated with observation of the effect of different light conditions on colors and textures: wind, trees, light fluorescent green, blowing with purple blue heavens. And the following landscape studies show evidence of attention to such details. The methodical side of Jo's character is evident in one sketchbook, which is divided into different categories: trees, roofs and tiles, walls and stones, greenery, plant, growth, foliage. So that while the disruption of the exile experience may be evident in some aspects of her work, it did not dominate it entirely. Nor was she bohemian. Property ownership was important to her, and she was critical of her father for not being interested in bricks and mortar, and so not providing her mother with a much desired house. Although not uncritical of her parents in this and other respects, her determination to honour their legacy attested to a filial piety which could only be described as traditional, a far cry from the iconoclasm evident in her pop art. She felt that her parents' potential had been frustrated by exile, for despite their intelligence and active social engagement, neither had achieved any measure of professional or material success. And Jo worked hard to achieve all that was in her power to redress this balance. Although the bulk of the extensive material left by both her parents was not sorted until after Jo retired, she had begun working on the legacy as early as 1983, when she approached the Victoria and Albert Museum and donated Charlotte's designs for commercial packaging on aluminium foil produced in the 1930s. She donated these to the Victoria and Albert Museum, and the slides that you can see there shows the V&A produced these designs as Christmas packaging and Christmas cards. In her final illness, Jo continued to manage her parents' legacy. From her hospital bed, she directed the completion of formalities concerning the bequest of her mother's papers to the Victoria and Albert, and made arrangements for the disposal of her father's papers, thus ensuring that this wide-ranging body of work comprising several genres was preserved. In the intervening years, Jo had facilitated several publications based on her parents' work. Escaping the Crooked Cross is her parents' internment correspondence. And this book on Highton has extracts from her father's diary written at the time when he was in Highton. At times directing the perception of her parents' lives, in particular analysing her mother's post-war business ventures from a feminist perspective, a position reflected in the paper on this topic given to the Conference on Exile and Agenda, organised by the Research Centre in September 2014. To this extent, Jo Bondy can be described as a curator as well as a custodian, who, despite the enfant terrible period of her middle years, was instrumental in facilitating the transmission of her cultural memory. The last slide just shows my thanks to the people who've given permission for the reproduction of this work to be shown, of her work to be shown. And also I forgot to mention that subsequent to Jo's death, her father's papers have been passed to the Senate House, University of London, and they are in the IMLR archive there. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for this thought-provoking insight into the work of a second-generation artist, which contrasted so strongly with that of her mother. I'm sure there'll be many questions that follow this seminar. Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Jennifer Taylor. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanna.